Morning, everybody. Back in the home church after being gone for the last 3 weeks, filling in over at Old Blue Creek. Why it's doing that with the light. Still trying to get the bugs worked out. Got a new phone. Apparently, Facebook says you can only tag a certain amount of people, and I was tagging too many because our group has grown to 57. And, okay, hold on. This is bothering me.
What are you going to do?
I know this is a riveting video live on Facebook. Okay.
That one just broke.
Didn't work. Hopefully if I get this curtain thing up, it will block enough of the window. There we go. That we won't get those light fluctuations. So, all right, like I said, we're up to 57, which is good. And that is not helping. Maybe, I don't know.
Do we need a spotlight?
We might have, they sell those ring things that you can mount on this that we may have to do that. Might actually become professional.
I can shine my flashlight on you if you want me to.
Yeah. No. This is really going to annoy me and annoy people trying to watch this. As I said, riveting. All right, so continuing on with the genealogy of Christ. The last one we did was Shem, who's the son of Noah. And of his 3 brothers, he was the most righteous. That's the one God chose to carry on the bloodline. I want to keep the background in there. All right, so now, depending on what you're reading, if you're going through the genealogy in Luke chapter 3.
Sorry, go ahead.
Are you watching? What is it doing here?
Just the look you gave the camera just a minute ago. ABI, just teach.
All right, so. Trying to find a good angle here. Like I said, new phone. Trying to work out the bugs with the new phone. And I'm really not liking this whole light flashy thingy. All right, so anyways. All right, so Noah's son Shem. Now Shem, again, was born before the flood. And then 2 years after the flood, he had his first son, Arphaxad, or Arpachshad, depending if you're reading in Genesis, if you're reading it in the New Testament under Luke. And if you've heard me talk about the Septuagint before, the Septuagint was a Greek translation. So when Alexander the Great conquered the Roman Empire, he built the library at Alexandria, which was in Egypt. And he placed one of his generals as a governor of Egypt, and the general's son went to the temple in Jerusalem and basically was able to commission a Greek translation of all of the Hebrew texts. They call it the Septuagint. And so that was actually what Jesus and the apostles and his disciples at the time used as a Bible, so to speak. They didn't have really the Hebrew Masoretic text, as they call it. They had the Septuagint. Jesus quotes the Septuagint. The apostles quote the Septuagints and all the epistles. And that's what Luke is quoting when he does his genealogy in chapter 3 of the Gospel according to Luke. So you have the difference here because you have Arphaxad, which is, you have ancient Hebrew names and you have Greek alliterations. It sounds like this, so we're going to spell it in Greek with Greek letters. So you have Arphaxad, or Arpaxad, who's when he was 130, he gave birth to Canaan. Now again, this is in Luke, and it's in the Septuagint. It is not in the Masoretic text, so it's not in your King James or English Standard or Holman Standard Bible, whatever. It's not in modern Bibles because somewhere close to 400 AD, the Catholics sent a guy named Jerome over to Jerusalem to find out why there was a difference between the Septuagint, what was going on between the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text. They convinced Jerome that the Masoretic text was correct and that the Septuagint was not. So that's why today we use the Masoretic text in all the translations, because it's a Catholic tradition. And unfortunately, that's where we got that from. So what ends up happening is you have basically 130 years added into the timeline. And so you throw that in there. So you have Shem, son Arphaxad, who then had a son named Canaan, who then had a son named Shelah, who then had a son named Eber. And we get to our character for today is Peleg. Peleg's mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. Where do you go? Let's see here. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, the reason I'm focusing on Peleg is not so much that he did anything. Obviously, he was righteous enough to be included in the genealogy of Christ. But it's when he was alive. What was going on while he was there? And what was going on at the time was the Tower of Babel. And in looking at new stuff, Babel, that's a traditional thing that we've had for many, many years in the King James. That's essentially Babylon. Babel itself means confusion. So Babylon is, it basically came out of Babel. Babel came out of Babylon. And that whole thing there means confusion. So we all hopefully know the story of the Tower of Babel, which can be found in Genesis chapter 11. And let's see here, starting in verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now, at the same time that Peleg was around, Noah's son Ham, all right, the guy who saw his father's nakedness and didn't cover him, Ham's descendants, one of which was Nimrod. And Nimrod was the first king of Babylon. That's in, let's see here. Here it is right here. Chapter 10, verse 8. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom, this is verse 10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Erech, Akkad, Calneh, all of that in the land of Shinar. So, strong guy, fierce guy, out hunting, great warrior, and he begins Babylon. He begins Babel. He was the guy who was considered king at the time. And if you get into reading Josephus and the different histories, Josephus was a Jewish historian. We actually get a lot of extra information about Christ, and we get confirmation of the crucifixion of Christ through Josephus. And Josephus wrote about Nimrod, and he wrote about Peleg. And so Nimrod's wife was Semiramis. Semiramis is actually the mother of false religion. So the whole point at the time of building the Tower of Babel, though, was to, let's see here, chapter 11, verse 4. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. All right, so two things going on here. First thing is God told them to disperse, to be fruitful and multiply and spread across the earth. And if you're sitting in one place, you're not doing that. And so, they're supposed to disperse, but they didn't. They were all hanging out together. They all had one language. And like I said, this all happened during Peleg's lifetime. Peleg's name actually means like a stream or a river, a division. Rivers run through the land and it splits the land, and it means division. And if you get into studying some of this stuff even deeper, basically Peleg was the father of many languages. And it was his, you're only talking about being 5 generations away from Abraham here. So time-wise, we're looking at around 2,200 years after the garden. Abraham comes around almost 400 years after the flood. So this, it didn't take long for them to decide that they were going to build this tower. And it's very representative of Satan. Satan is the father of confusion. God is not. God is the father of order. Satan is the father of confusion. Babylon means confusion. Babble. That's why we say people babble on and babble, and we don't understand what they're saying. That's where we get those phrases from. So, like I said, Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, you look her up, and she actually gets into the prophecy given to Eve, and she takes that because it turns out she was having an affair and actually had Nimrod murdered, and she came up pregnant and claimed that Nimrod had become the sun god and that her child was the incarnation of the sun god. And really weird, but that's also where we get the 40 days of Lent from. That's actually a mourning period for the death of her newborn child that was actually killed by wild animals. It's really very soap opera-esque, but again, you get that from the historians. You don't really get that from the Bible. And a lot of that history has been confirmed and found from multiple historians that come from that time frame. So, the Tower of Babel, and it's as you learn more about Satan, we're not given a lot of information about Satan in Genesis other than the fact that he was there in the garden in the form of a serpent. And we learn more about Satan in the New Testament. There's actual dealings, but you have Job. If you go read Job, that will tell you more information about Satan. If you read Prophet Zechariah, there's Joshua had dealings with the devil. So the devil pops up all throughout here, and as you read further in the New Testament, you get more information. But one of the things you learn about Satan is that he wanted God's throne. He wanted to be like God. He wanted to actually replace God. He didn't want to just be an angel of light as a servant. He didn't want to just be a servant. He wanted to put himself in charge. And what I see when I read this, yes, they're not obeying God, who said to disperse and spread out and, fill the earth and be fruitful and multiply. They're not doing that. Then on top of that, they're building a tower to try and get to heaven. And obviously we know today you can't do that. We've put rockets up into space, and we have people floating around a space station, but they're no closer to God than they were here on Earth. And, so we know that just putting yourselves up in the clouds doesn't do anything for you, except put you way up there with a lack of oxygen. Now, it didn't get that big. They didn't have the technology to build these massive skyscrapers like we have today. I forget how tall the tallest building is in the world right now. I know that when they rebuilt the World Trade Center, at the top of the radio antenna, on top of it, it is 1,776 feet tall. And yes, that is because our nation was started in 1776. So, but there's other buildings around the world. I think there's a building in Bahrain that's taller than that. And but they had bricks. And if you get into studying the ziggurats, and you start looking all over the world, they have all these funky temples, and they're kind of these pyramid type, square things usually. Lots of steps going up the side, some kind of altar at the very top of them. Some are bigger than others. And it is believed that Josephus actually drew some pictures of what it was described to look like. And so you have basically almost like a pyramid going up, and when the dispersal happened, when God came down and didn't like what he saw going on at Babel, and he broke everybody up and confused their languages, they still knew how to build buildings like this. They knew how to do all that kind of stuff. So they took those building styles. That's why you see them all through Mexico. You see them down in South America. You see them all over India, China, places like these. You found these ziggurat style temples that were built in a very similar fashion to the Tower of Babel. I shared an article from Answers in Genesis, and they're figuring their best estimation is, again, taken from Antiquities and Josephus and different historians. Their best estimation is about 20 stories tall, which that's massive undertaking for that day and age when you're talking about making your bricks out of, hay and sand and mud and whatever they were using to make bricks. And, that the pyramids aren't even that tall. Which, again, that's just a slightly more advanced version of a ziggurat. The pyramids in Egypt, which were built thousands of years later, after the Tower of Babel was destroyed. So, chapter 11, verse 6, verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Again, children of man, the descendants of Cain. Not the children of God, not the righteous people, the unrighteous people, the descendants of Cain, the children of man. Verse 6, and the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And, here, God and some other folks, most likely the Trinity here, verse 7, come let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So, I didn't understand this for many, many, many years. And why would you confuse everybody's language so they couldn't work together? And it might seem a little disjointed, but when I initially learned that, I heard this on the radio when I was driving a truck, but every year they have an annual convention of judges, worldwide convention of judges, and they all come together and meet to decide and talk about how they're going to rule, not based on the law of their nation, but how they're going to rule, what general direction they're going to lean in for rulings on social issues. And, not everybody goes to this, but the big major judges and federal judges go, and all these judges go. And that's when it clicked in my head that when you have all these people that communicate in one language, and they want to do something that God doesn't want them to do, there's power in numbers. When we humans, if we can get together and all get on the same page, we can accomplish great things. The problem is that, and we're seeing this today, the problem is that we want to accomplish great things that God does not want us to accomplish. They're not righteous. They're not good things. And they always lead to evil. And, like I said, Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, it was the mother of false religion. So, they're trying to build a tower to get to heaven. They're inventing their own gods. They decided they needed a sun god. And, and this is... Ham knew that the flood happened, which means Nimrod knew that the flood happened, that God flooded the earth. They knew God was real. And so, but they're still going to make up their own gods, and they're still going to worship false gods, despite the fact that these people know 100% for a fact, without a doubt, that God is real and that God is powerful. And, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born before the flood. Like I said, it took about 75 years, roughly, to build the ark. Shem had his first son, Arphaxad, 2 years after the flood, and Shem was 100 years old. So Shem was about 25 years old when they started building the ark, roughly. And he definitely would have told Arphaxad, again, Ham was alive too. Ham was about, was close to the same age. Maybe they were a year apart. There's nothing to say they were triplets. You can go either way with that. It doesn't hurt if you think they were. But they were all alive before the flood, so they knew exactly what life was like on earth before the flood. They knew how evil people were. They knew how everybody was out seeking their own pleasure instead of seeking righteousness. And he knew how people laughed at them and made fun of them and called them conspiracy theorists as they were building the ark, and nobody wanted to get on the boat until it was too late. So Ham would know this, and yet again, Ham committed a sin against his father. Because of that, his son was cursed. Ham himself, like I talked about this last week, Ham was not cursed. It was his son who was cursed. And, maybe that's why. Maybe they got mad and upset and didn't want to seek forgiveness and humble themselves, so they kept going in the wrong direction. And we do that. People do that. We don't want anybody to come at us and say that you're doing something wrong. Nobody likes that. We don't like to be called out for our mistakes. And I'm like that. I don't like to be fussed at if I do something wrong. But I understand and I know that A, I need to do it right, and B, I need to be able to correct myself. So if nobody confronts me and says, you're doing it wrong, I'm going to keep doing it wrong, and which will eventually lead to problems. So maybe that's the thought process, but so God came down. He didn't like what was going on. That people were not dispersing like they were supposed to. They were supposed to spread out and be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, right? Because you go from millions of people down to 8, and only 6 of them had kids. So, Noah didn't have any more kids after the flood. But he lived something like 350 years after the flood. So, and I mentioned this before, the ages of people started getting younger. In other words, people started dying sooner. Arphaxad lived like 300 years. Canaan lived 300 something years. Shelah lived, a couple hundred years. You start noticing that they're getting, younger and younger when they die. And God said that, your years on this earth will be 120. I'm not going to strive with man for much longer. And so you start seeing that, like if you go to the Septuagint or you go to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, you see that, Canaan is in there. So Arphaxad, he only lived 200 or 300 years, but then when Canaan was Arphaxad was 130, he had Canaan. When Canaan was 30, he had Shelah. When Shelah was 34, he had Eber. So they're having kids much sooner, and they're not living near as long. So, excuse me. So the time spans are getting shorter. I got time on this one. I didn't have a time clock on my iPhone, which I went back to an Android. I didn't have a time clock on the iPhone, so it was hard for me to know when I was coming up on when I needed to shut this video down, but I do have a time clock on this one now, so I got a few more minutes to run my mouth. I definitely got to figure out this whole light fluctuation thing. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe I just need to clean the sensor off or something. Anyways, all right, so, like I said, Peleg himself was not anything super special other than just being a righteous dude. But it was what happened while he was alive, and it was the Tower of Babel, and it's just another example of man's capacity for sin, man's capacity for thumbing their nose at God, so to speak. And, Satan is the inspiration for all of this. As you learn more about Satan and what his goals were, when you read the description of why they were building the tower, that's very similar. They want to put themselves up in heaven with God. Satan wanted to put himself on God's throne. I mean, there's so many similarities in the thought process here of essentially selfishness. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to be remembered. Well, what a bad thing to be remembered for. That's... And so, the whole world got dispersed. Peleg, lived several more years. And like I said, which next week's lesson will be about Abraham. Peleg there's 5 generations after Peleg before you get to Abraham. And of course, Abraham is the father of faith. And, so it doesn't take long. It was somewhere roughly 380 to 400 years after the flood is when Abraham comes along. So, within a couple hundred years within 150 or so years of the flood, humans went right back to sinning. And of course, God promised not to flood the earth again, thankfully, and gave us the rainbow to remind us and to remind him that he promised not to flood the earth. Although if you skip ahead to Revelation, he's going to burn the whole thing down. But that's years down the road, hopefully. But that's Peleg and the genealogy of Christ. And like I said, next week we'll get into Abraham. Glad to be back here in my home church. I have enjoyed the last 3.5 weeks filling in.
You're gone 4 weeks, aren't you?
I did 3 Sundays and 4 Wednesdays. Which was, I really enjoyed that over at Old Blue Creek. You can check out my videos on that. And it's just been a blessing. It's been I enjoyed it. It was a blessing, and look forward to the next opportunity I get to fill in somewhere else. But I am glad to be back in my home church, and we'll get back on schedule doing this. And, I was doing this on Saturday nights, and, it's good to be back. It's good to be blessed. And remember the Corley family Vinny Corley has passed away a few days ago. And, as they deal with that, be in prayer for everybody out there dealing with this COVID junk, dealing with cancer. There's other diseases besides COVID going on right now. People are still getting cancer and still trying to deal with that. So, just be in prayer for your brothers and sisters out there and look for ways you can help. With that being said, you guys be blessed, and I will see you next time.